This morning we're continuing on in our series in Daniel, looking at Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 to 28. It reads, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, 'In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind troubled me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So that's perfectly clear, right? Everybody understood exactly what was going on there. So, first I want to start off by talking about war. Our world is a world that has always known war. The first war mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis 14:1, which, if you believe the dating, places it approximately 4,000 years ago. And war has pretty much been a constant somewhere in the world ever since, right up to and including today. But of all of the thousands of wars that have been fought, perhaps none were quite as devastating on a global world civilization scale as World Wars I and II. World War I lasted for 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, and resulted in 10 million military deaths, 7 million civilian deaths, 21 million wounded, and 7.7 million missing or imprisoned. World War II lasted for 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, and it resulted in a staggering amount of death. They don't even know for sure exactly how many people died, so many died. And the estimates range anywhere from 50 to 80 million people losing their life during World War II, which includes 38 to 55 million civilians, and then 13 to 20 million who died from war-related disease and famine. Whenever two countries or two groups of people go to war with one another, it's always a terrible and devastating thing. But when the entire world goes to war, the death and destruction that it can cause is really beyond any comprehensible belief. But guess what? We're living in a world that is at war every single day. Not a war fought with tanks and bombers and drones, but a war between the forces of darkness and those of light, between good and evil, between God and Satan. This war is going on all around us at all times, even though we can't perceive it. It's an invisible war, but that doesn't make its devastation any less real. It doesn't mean that it doesn't take a toll on humanity. Quite the contrary. I would argue that the fact that we live in a world constantly at war takes a toll on all of us on some level, be it physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. And the fact that we live in a world that's at war between good and evil means that we need to understand that we live in a world of beasts. We live in a world of evil. We must understand that God is engaged in warfare with the powers and principalities of evil and will one day finally fully judge and defeat them. And we must be certain of this victory. That's what this passage today from Daniel teaches us. But first, I want to talk to you a bit about the study of apocalyptic literature, because that's what we're going to be looking at during the rest of our time in Daniel. Chapter 6 was the end of the narrative portion, the story portion of Daniel, and chapter 7 starts the prophetic half. So 7 through 12 is all going to be apocalyptic prophecy. So apocalyptic literature is some of the most difficult in all of the Bible to understand. So I want to lay the foundation here to help us understand it. So first things first, what is apocalyptic literature? Well, the term apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means revelation. In fact, the name for the genre apocalyptic literature comes from the first the first verse of the book of Revelation, which is also known as the Apocalypse of John. And in the first verse, John writes that the book was the revelation or the apocalypsis from Jesus Christ. Apocalyptic literature looks ahead to the end of history, but it does it through the lens of hope and joy in realizing that God is the ultimate victor over all of his enemies and those who would harm and oppress his people. In the case of Daniel, the apocalyptic literature continues the themes from the narrative half of the book. In those stories, we read about God in his ultimate sovereignty and control, defeating the forces of evil of the day and saving his people from things like the fiery furnace and the lion's den. Now, in the apocalyptic half, we're seeing God in his ultimate sovereignty and control, defeating all evil forces for good and saving his people from oppression, destruction, and even death itself. But that only answers part of the question, doesn't it? Because even if we know what apocalyptic literature is, how are we supposed to interpret and understand it? How are we supposed to understand what all of these beasts, lions with wings and leopards with 4 heads, what on earth does all that mean? Well, we understand it by understanding that apocalyptic literature is laden with imagery, with metaphors and similes and symbols. And this imagery is used to teach difficult to understand concepts by relating them to something that is known from common experience. To teach through relation and through evoking emotions in the reader. So we should be careful when we're interpreting prophetic literature, apocalyptic literature, to not interpret the imagery too literally or to press into it for too many finite details. I don't think when the world comes to an end one day that there's going to be a four-headed leopard with four wings come flying in. I don't think that's what we're going to be seeing. I think that's an image to teach a point. So we need to understand that while these images are true, meaning they convey truth, they're not meant to be 100% precise. And what that means is that we can't try to interpret the imagery in apocalyptic literature literally. Instead, we have to look for the meaning behind the image, for the truth that's present within it. If we do that, then we begin to really mine the depths of these passages for all of the rich truth that's really there. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to our chapter today, Daniel 7. And right off the bat in verse 1, the timeline of this vision is set. And we see that we're actually going backwards in time, right? Chapter 6 took place after the Medo-Persians had taken Babylon and Darius the Mede was in power. But here we read that this vision in chapter 7 came to Daniel during the reign of Belshazzar, the last Babylonian ruler, the one who witnessed the handwriting on the wall. So what we can see is Daniel got this vision before he was ever thrown in the lion's den. So we've traveled backwards in time a little bit. The vision itself begins then with the world in a state of chaos and upheaval, which is what's meant when Daniel says the four winds of heaven were churning up the great sea. It means the world was in chaos. It means complete sinfulness and instability have gripped the world. And in the midst of this, four great beasts, each one different from the other, emerged from the sea, as we read in verse 3. Now, each beast is a metaphor for a kingdom or for a world power. And them emerging from the sea is a metaphor for their rising up onto the world stage. And the language that Daniel uses in describing these beasts shows that they were not autonomous, they were not sovereign, but were at the mercy of another. For example, Daniel writes that the lion was lifted off the ground. Not the lion got up off the ground, he was lifted. And a man's heart was given to the lion in verse 4. Or when Daniel says the bear-like creature was commanded to get up and eat its fill of flesh in verse 5. That shows they're not autonomous, but that God is in control of all of these events. And it's he who is causing these powers to rise and to fall. The only beast that's not described using the language of dependence is the fourth most terrible beast in verse 7. Perhaps that's why Daniel notes that it was different from the others. Now, an important note to make about these four beasts and what they represent. Since chapter 7 is the last chapter to be written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, and chapter 2 is the first chapter written in Aramaic, these two chapters share a connection with each other. And that connection goes deeper when you consider the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. That statue had four parts, and there are four beasts in Daniel chapter 7. These connections make it logical then to say that the four beasts of chapter 7 represent the same empires as the statue of chapter 2. Namely that the lion is Babylon, the bear is Medo-Persia, the leopard is Greece, and the fourth beast is Rome. But there's actually another popular opinion that has arisen that these four beasts actually represent Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And this interpretation has gained traction because it does seem that many of the prophecies of Daniel 7 to 12 were fulfilled during the time of what's known as the Seleucid Empire, which is an empire that rose to prominence from the ashes of Alexander the Great's Macedonian or Greek Empire. So on the one hand, you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, or on the other hand, you have Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And both of those interpretations have a lot in their favor. But as we talked about in Sunday school, the point is not so much to specifically identify these four beasts as to understand what they represent metaphorically. Which is, as these kingdoms rise and as they fall, God is still there in control of all of it. As far as the details that Daniel records about each beast, that they were lifted off the ground or they could eat their fill of flesh, I don't want to get into all of that. That is explaining certain aspects of these empires, but it's not pertinent to the overall message. So I don't want to wade into the weeds of all of that, just dissecting each individual beast and what they mean. Instead, we'll move straight into verse 8, where we encounter perhaps the most peculiar part of the entire vision, as Daniel sees that a little horn arose amongst the 10 horns of the fourth beast and uprooted 3 of the horns in its wake. Also, we're told that it had the eyes and mouth of a man and spoke boastfully. Pretty weird, right? A horn on a head with eyes and a mouth and speaking. But the crazy thing is that's all Daniel tells us. He moves on to something else. He says, there's this horn, it has eyes and a mouth and speaks boastfully. And then he changes the subject. Like, hold on a minute. I want to know more about this weird horn. Let's get back to that. But we're going to have to wait for a couple of verses to hear more about it, because right as Daniel sees this little horn, court is called to session in verses 9 to 10. As the thrones are put in place and the Ancient of Days, that is God, takes his seat of judgment. And the fact that this is a seat of judgment is proven in the imagery of the throne. The throne is flaming with fire. A river of fire was flowing from it before God. This fiery imagery is the imagery of judgment. So God is sitting on his judgment seat. And this vision that Daniel sees of God in his court is meant to do exactly what it does. It's meant to inspire awe. It's meant to remind us that even as worldly kingdoms rise and fall, God's kingdom is immovable and unchangeable. It is everlasting. And it's meant to remind us of the triumph and glory and majesty of God, right? Because it says he's attended by thousands upon thousands, and he has 10,000 times 10,000 standing before him. That shows us that he is Lord of all, and that all will one day bow before him. Then in verse 11, we read that while all of this was happening, that little horn was still boasting away. So God, in his sovereignty and his righteousness, judges the beast and enacts its punishment, the punishment of death. It says that the other beasts have their power stripped, but they're not immediately killed, which gives us the understanding that while God's judgment is complete, he reserves the right to withhold punishment as he sees fit. He can judge somebody and not punish them right away if he so chooses, because he's God, even though we can trust that he will eventually bring all worldly powers to a definitive end. And this truth is meant to give Daniel's original readers the hope of knowing that the present success of God's enemies does not mean their future success. Even though Babylon and Persia and Rome are lording over you right now, that isn't going to last forever. They will be defeated. And finally, in verse 13, the verse which Jesus himself alluded to when he was being tried before the Sanhedrin, which we read a few minutes ago, Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we don't need to wonder who this son of man is, right? Because Jesus tells us who it is. It's him, the very Son of God. This is man in all of his perfection. This man is the one who can enter into the presence of God and stand in the face of the fires of judgment. This man, for all intents and purposes, is who God meant for all men to be, but we ruined it by letting sin into the world. Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of Man, succeeded where Adam and every other human being had failed. So the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days, and he's given dominion. A dominion that Daniel tells us in verse 14 is glorious, universal, and everlasting. It's a dominion over everyone and everything that will never be destroyed. And with that, Daniel's vision ends. And I feel like that's a lot to take in. I feel like we might need a little bit of a breather, maybe a bathroom break. Anybody need to use the bathroom? Just kidding. Let's dive in and take a look at what exactly all this actually means. In verse 15, Daniel tells us that all that he had seen troubled him. So he approached one of them standing there, likely one of the angels around the throne of God, and asked him the meaning of the vision. And the good news is that we have already covered a good portion of what the vision means while we were talking about it, so we won't need to rehash it, but we'll still discuss the parts we haven't covered. And the first thing of interest is what the angel says to Daniel in verse 18. He says, the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. That statement right there means that God's children, those who accept his offer of salvation through faith in his Son, the Son of Man, Jesus, will share in the reign of Jesus as joint heirs with him. We are joint heirs with Jesus. We will reign with Jesus over the new heaven and the new earth. And after hearing this profound statement, Daniel's attention is drawn back to the image of the fourth beast with its little horn speaking boastfully. And this time Daniel gives us more information about this horn. And he tells us that the horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Daniel's concerned because he realizes even though God's victory over the little horn is assured, he's also aware of how much suffering and anguish and turmoil that God's people will have to go through at its hands before it is punished. So the angel explains in verses 23 to 25 that the fourth beast is a kingdom that was still yet to come, from which 10 kings will arise. And after these 10 kings, another one will arise that's different from them and will defeat 3 of the 10 kings. And this king will blaspheme God, will oppress God's people, and will try to change their holy laws and practices. And God will deliver his people into this king's hand for a time, times, and half a time. Now, there are a couple things I think we need to note here regarding numbers, because too often people try to interpret the numbers in apocalyptic literature literally, when it's generally best to understand they're being used symbolically. So we probably don't need to look for 10 specific kings or governments in history that this vision is referring to, because the number 10 is likely being used here to symbolically mean completeness. And the number 3 is likely being used symbolically to mean that a sizable group of those kings or governments will be defeated. And we can say this with some confidence because unlike the 4 beasts, there are no specific details given to us about the 10 horns, which likely shows us they have a general significance rather than a specific significance. There's not a one-to-one equivalent for these 10 kings. We also need to understand that we don't have to interpret a time, times, and half a time to mean 3.5 years, as many have suggested. Just as I explained, we didn't need to interpret the 7 times that Nebuchadnezzar would be subhuman in chapter 4 to mean 7 years. Instead, we can understand a time to mean a set period of time, and times to mean twice that time, and half a time to mean half that time. Putting it together, it does add up to 3.5, but it could be 3.5 days, 3.5 weeks, 3.5 months, 3.5 years, 3.5 centuries, 3.5 millennia. Nowhere is it specified that a time equals a year. In fact, I would argue that the definition of a time in apocalyptic verses is left intentionally ambiguous because it's not referring to actual time periods, but is instead referring to symbolic time. A time, times, and half a time is given to us here, not so we can solve the mystery of when these events will take place, but so we can be confident that all these events are under the authority and control of God and are unfolding according to his plan and his timeline. Remember, Daniel was written to remind its readers of the sovereign control of God, and that's what's being accomplished here. The point is not to understand the exact length of time, but to understand that God's people will be delivered into the hands of the little horn for the exact amount of time that God in his sovereignty has appointed. Not a moment more, not a moment less. And this understanding is supported by how many people have predicted the date of the end times and been wrong. How many times in your life have you heard somebody say, the world's going to end on March 3rd, 1985, or whatever? Has anybody been right yet? No, because they're trying to give specific significance to symbolic time. And Acts 1:7 tells us it's not for us to know periods of time or appointed times which the Father has set by his own authority. Now the question then is, who or what is the little horn? And there's been volume after volume written about that very question. For those who subscribe to the view that the fourth beast represents Rome, the little horn is equated with an antichrist figure who will rule over some form of a revived Roman Empire at the end of days. They see the terror of the little horn as a future event. But for those who subscribe to the view that the fourth beast represents Greece, the little horn is equated with the historical figure known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was a Seleucid king who ruled over Israel and Palestine from 175 to 164 BC. He was a terrible ruler, and he treated the Jews horribly, so they rebelled. And in response to this rebellion, Antiochus slayed many innocent Jews and brutally enforced his cultural and religious policies on the population. A time of great tribulation then occurred in Judea as traditional practices like circumcision were outlawed, the sacred scriptures were burned, and violators were brutally punished and even put to death. Antiochus laid siege to the Temple Mount, destroyed many of its fortifications, and built a new fortress to consolidate his power over Jerusalem. And then finally, as a culmination of this campaign of terror, he profaned God's temple by erecting idols in it and sacrificing pigs on the Lord's altar, presumably to the god Zeus. Because of this, all of this, one could argue that Antiochus was the model for the popular image of the Antichrist. Following these atrocities, then, Antiochus left his generals in charge of Judea, and he went to fight wars in the east. The Jews went on to revolt under the leadership of the Maccabees, winning their political and religious freedom. Antiochus sounds a little bit like this little horn, doesn't he? So let me tell you my interpretation of the little horn, and you can do with it what you will. My interpretation is that the little horn is a lens looking through the atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes and into the future anguish of God's people under the Antichrist at the end of days. It's a snapshot showing us that God's people are going to face oppression and persecution throughout the history of the world. And it reminds us that even in times of extreme persecution, God is still in control. And his plans and purposes are still being fulfilled. That, as we read in verses 26 and 27, all the powers of this earth will be brought to judgment before God as he ushers in his perfect heavenly kingdom. So I think this prophecy of the little horn points to both things. It points specifically to the reign and terror of Antiochus, that time period in Jewish history of great suffering, and then is a foreshadowing to the time of suffering that will come with the Antichrist at the end of days. This means that these visions of Daniel are really prophesying two important times in history: the extreme oppression and persecution of Antiochus and the trials and tribulations of the final battle between good and evil. So now what on earth does all of this mean for us in the 21st century? What do we care about Antiochus Epiphanes from 3,000 years ago? Well, first it means that we must understand that we live in a world full of beasts. We live in a world full of evil. When Adam and Eve committed the original sin, they gave Satan dominion in this world. They gave free reign over the hearts, souls, and minds of humanity. So this world is all too often an evil place filled with evil things. We need to realize that this world is broken. This world is sinful. There are evil people. There are evil powers at work. It is corrupted. It is fallen. It is anti-God because of original sin. We need to understand the world that we're in is a world full of evil. That we are strangers in a strange land. That we are living in a world that is not our home. That people will attack us for our faith. People will oppose us for our faith. Atrocities will be committed. Not because God is making atrocities happen, but because our sin has allowed this world to become so corrupted that atrocities naturally flow from it. We need to understand that. We need to accept that reality. But the good news is that the evil of this world isn't the end of the story, because the second thing we should take from this vision is that God is engaged in warfare with Satan and the powers and principalities of evil. And he's going to finally judge and defeat them. Satan can't win because he's already lost. In Jesus' death and resurrection, Satan was fully defeated. Now we're just waiting for him to be finally and permanently defeated when he stands before the judgment seat of God like everyone else. And spoiler alert, if you didn't know that, when Satan stands before the judgment seat of God, That's not going to go very well for Satan. What does that mean for us? It means that even though we live in a world filled with evil, there's nothing Satan can do to us because he's already lost. Right? When you think about it that way, Satan has lost the war. It's over. And so what he's doing now is he's just trying to bring as many people down with him as he can. He has no power. Ultimately, there's nothing he can do to you. He can oppress you. He can tempt you and torment you, and he can do all of that. But ultimately, that's all superficial if you have Jesus in your heart. Because you already belong to him. You are already on the side that wins the war. And as I've said up here more than one time, even if Satan takes your life, that's not a loss. You didn't lose because you get to go be with Jesus. That's still a victory. There's nothing Satan can do to you when you have Jesus in your heart. Because Jesus has already won and Satan is already lost. And finally, the third thing that we should take away from this vision is that we must be 100% certain of God's victory. And how can we be certain of this victory? We just said it. We can be certain because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus won for us the victory, so we should live in that victory. We should live as victorious people. We shouldn't cower in fear. We shouldn't be afraid of the angry mob. We shouldn't be afraid of people calling us names or persecuting us for our faith. We shouldn't be afraid of going through trials and tribulations in this world, because all of that is temporary. It is fleeting. Jesus has already won for us the victory. So when you're facing down a trial, face it as, I've already won this trial. I've already overcome this trial. I've already beaten this trial. And that gives you the mentality that the troubles and difficulties of this life are not as significant as the eternal reality of a place in God's kingdom. And it allows you to get through the difficult times with more strength to say, this is a temporary thing. I will get to the other side of this. And it doesn't defeat you. It doesn't beat you down. But you can push through the trial. You can face it confidently, knowing that Jesus is on your side and you've already won that victory. Don't live in defeat. Don't live in fear. Your Savior has already won. He is victorious. So live in that victory. And then ultimately, Jesus' victory should spur us into sharing the gospel with everyone so they can share in his victory. When someone is not saved, they're on the losing team. They belong to this world, they belong to the devil, and they've lost. But the minute they accept Jesus, they inherit his victory. And they have the assurance of an eternity in his kingdom as well. So when we look at someone who's not saved, we should have compassion and say, I want you to have the victory that I have. I don't want you to live in defeat. Let me tell you how you can live in victory. Let me tell you what you're missing. Let me tell you what you're searching for. Because all of your problems have already been defeated if you have Jesus. Because he's already won the victory. So that should spur us into a desire to share the gospel. So why did God want Daniel to see these things and relay them to others? Well, the Jewish people by this point had been exiled in Babylon for decades upon decades. They likely thought there would never come a day when they would see the promised land again. They likely thought God had abandoned them, that he had given up and left them to be punished forever for their sins. So God gave Daniel this vision of the end of the story so that his people would know that even though it seemed like God was no longer there, was no longer working on their behalf, he was indeed still there. And not only was he still there, he was still sovereign and in control as he worked all things according to his plans and purposes. And since we today know the end of the story, since we know that God is ultimately victorious, since we know that only God is our judge and Jesus is our Savior, since we know that we have a future in his kingdom, then what can this world throw at us to cause us to fear and doubt? To make us tremble and waver in our faith? The answer should be absolutely nothing. God is in control. He has already won the victory. The cross of Jesus Christ is the seal that guarantees that. So let the world do its worst. Because no matter what it does, hope remains. And that hope is this, that nothing nothing can separate you from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. Amen.